Hey guys, Brian from JB Custom Woodworking here again. I wanted to do a follow-up video and share a few thoughts about the Harvey Alpha Series table saw that I bought and have been using now for about a month. So the first thing I did when I got this thing all set up, I discovered that 34-inch deck height is just a little too low for someone who's over 6 feet tall. So what I did and what I would suggest you do is just make yourself a base. Now this is pretty basic stuff. It's just a couple of 2x4s laying on edge with a piece of 3/4 inch melamine put on the top of them. And that raises the deck height to 36.5 inches. And I find that to be much more comfortable. Now, the second thing I did was when I put the tape on, I didn't line it up properly. I didn't realize that the tape had to be really close to the edge of the rail, and when I put it up here, it missed the sight glass, and when you run the fence over it, it doesn't line up the cursor properly. So I peeled the tape off and restuck it, but by that time it had lost most of its stickiness and it wouldn't go back on. So I had to go to Lee Valley and I bought this tape, which has larger numbers, which I find quite helpful. And this goes up to, I think it was 6 feet long, so it was very easy to install. But the downside is I can't get this guck off of here. Even with Goo Gone, it doesn't come off because there's some kind of a rubberized coating, or I don't know what this stuff is, but there's some kind of coating on here, and the Goo Gone doesn't take the tape off. It just kind of makes a mess of it. So I haven't quite figured out how to get rid of that yet. The other thing I did, and I'm not the only one who's done this according to the feedback I got, is I put this enormous scratch in the rail the very first time I set the saw up. And this really annoyed me, and I think it's something Harvey needs to address. And it turns out it's a very simple fix. So what I've done, I flipped the fence upside down here. And if you look at this piece here, this is, I don't know what the official name is, but I call this the paddle. This is what gets squeezed against the rail to lock the rail in position. But what happens is that this edge and this edge are very sharp. And what happens is if you put the fence on and the thing is in that position and you don't realize it because you're looking at the top of the thing, it'll put an enormous scratch in the table. So the secret is to remove this bolt, which pulls this out, take your angle grinder and just gently round over these edges, here. There's no need for this thing to be sharp, and this is just one thing that Harvey could do that would make things a lot easier and a lot less frustrating, because if you got a brand new saw and it costs this much money and suddenly you got a giant scratch that you're going to look at for the rest of your life, it can get kind of annoying. Now, one of the other things I noticed is when I went to put my general tenoning jig, which worked just fine with my general table saw, I didn't realize that the distance from the miter gauge slot to the blade is different on this saw than it is on the general. So on this tenoning jig, you'll see there's a couple of adjustment screws here, but I've already got it in the outward position, and it's still not quite enough. So it appears that the thinnest tenon I can cut is going to be about 3/8 of an inch, and that's just not sufficient. There's a lot of times when you need to go down to 1/4 inch of a tenon. Now, it seems that the easy fix for this is just to take, this thing comes with 2 holes from the factory, and it's basically take it apart and drill a 3rd hole here and on the back side as well. But that's just one little thing that I noticed, because this is a very good tenoning jig, and I figure if this one has the problem, then they're all going to have the problem, because I don't know if there's a standard distance between the miter gauge slot and the blade on saws, or if it's just up to the manufacturer. Because I noticed on this one, it just appears to be off by about an inch maybe, and that runs past the range of what the gauge will accompany. One of the other things I noticed is that the opening in the throat plate is a little wide for my liking. And what happens quite frequently is small thin pieces of wood, say about 1/16 of an inch, will actually go down in there, and they can get caught in the blade and shoot back up at you. So when I was over at Lee Valley the other day, I found this stuff, and it's called zero clearance tape. And what it is, basically, it's 5 strips of double-sided tape that's about 16 inches long and 2 inches wide. And I think it was about $10 or $12, so it's a good deal. And all you basically do is you take this, put the blade all the way down, trim this to fit the throat plate, attach it, and then slowly lift the blade up through it to give you a zero clearance gate. Now, you can actually buy a zero clearance insert from Harvey, but I think they're somewhere around $100. So this one with 5 pieces for $10 just seemed to be a better value. And I can also use this on my sliding compound miter saw and any other machinery that has a throat plate. Now, one of the other things I wanted to point out is the riving knife. So let me just see if I can just set the camera up a little better here. Okay, so the riving knife is a very important feature on a table saw because it stops kickback. Now, there are times when you have to remove this riving knife. For example, if you put a dado blade on, you can't run a riving knife with a dado stack. So this thing comes off quite nicely. You basically put your finger in here, and there's a little knob that you pull back and you rotate, and then this thing just lifts out with a firm grip here. Now, the funny thing about this is, the important thing about this is when you go to put the riving knife back in the saw, it's really important to make sure that it seats properly. So pull back the pin, push this down until it is all the way in, and then make sure that the pin relocks. If you don't lock the riving knife in place, there is a potential for it to rattle loose with vibrations on the saw. And if this thing ends up touching the blade when it's at full throttle, it's going to come at you like a ninja throwing star, and that's not really the kind of thing that you want. Now let's talk about the sliding table for just a sec. This thing works like a charm, and I'm very impressed with it. There are a couple things that I would like to see. First off, on the miter gauge itself, when you want to move it left and right, there are a couple of hex keys like everything else on the saw. So there's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. This would be really handy if you were able to turn these by hand and not have to look for your hex keys. The same with when you go to mount the miter gauge on the table tracks. It takes a hex key, one here, and then turning this knob to make it tight. Now this isn't quite so bad, but it really would be nice if you could move the thing from left to right without having to, adjust these 3 keys with the hex key. But having said that, this sliding table is a wonderful thing. So the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that this piece doesn't have to be mounted flush with this piece. You can mount this anywhere along the table that you need. And the reason it's flexible is if you do a lot of wide cuts and a lot of steep miters. So if you had a 2-inch panel, or sorry, a 2-foot panel, and you're mitering it at 45 degrees, you're not going to get a lot of support because basically the panel's going to start about here when it goes through the sled. So if you take this piece and you loosen the 2 bolts and you slide it down to the mid position or even to the end position, it can accommodate a lot wider pieces with a lot steeper cutting angles. I also highly recommend that you mount the power switch on the rail and not underneath the sliding table. And the reason for that is it's really important to know where this thing is at all times, because if you need to shut the saw off in a hurry, having it in this position all the time means that you can hit the red button with your knee and it shuts it off. But if you have the thing mounted to the table, and just give me a second here. If you have the switch mounted on the table and you have the table in its normal rear position, the power switch is under here, and it's fairly easy to get to with your hand, but it's nowhere as convenient, and in this case, convenience and safety are very closely related. So I would strongly recommend that you mount the switch onto the rail just to make it more accessible. Now, if you notice in the literature on the 4-horsepower saw, Harvey refers to this as a dovetail cabinet saw, and the 2-horse and the 3-horse aren't like this. And at first that kind of confused me as to what it meant, but what it means basically is the way that the motor and the blade are related and mounted to each other. So on the 2 and 3 horsepower, you have the typical rack and pinion system. And what happens when you raise the blade on that is it comes up at an angle. Now with this one, when you raise the blade, it comes straight up out of the table. And that's because the whole mechanism is sliding on a dovetail. So the blade comes directly up through the table and doesn't come up on an angle the way it would on a rack and pinion. Now this one still has the rack and pinion for left-right tilt, and there's no real way to get around that. But that's why it's called a dovetail saw, is because the trunnion slides up and down on a dovetail. So overall, I'm really impressed with the saw so far after a month. It's done a really nice job of everything that I've asked it to do. The fit and finish and the accuracy are as good as any saw that I've ever used. I do a lot of cutting on 8/4 hard maple, and it has no trouble powering through that with the blade that I got with it, or even with any of my other CMT or Freud blades. So I would highly recommend this saw as an alternative to some of the other ones that are out there. I know there's not a lot of selection for saws these days in Canada. If you take SawStop out of the mix, you're basically left with King International and King International and Harvey, and there's not really a lot left over. I didn't want to buy the SawStop because I couldn't justify the extra $2,000, and I don't think I need the safety brake because I'm working in the shop by myself. I don't have employees or students around, so I would highly recommend the Harvey as an alternative to any of the other saws that are on the market. That's all I have for now. If you have any thoughts or questions, please put them in the comments, and we can all learn together, and I'll try to respond to them as quickly as I can. Thanks for watching.